It's a pleasure for me to be here, at least today, and to welcome more officially Rabbi Angel and really thank him. And of course, he's a wonderful scholar. He's been teaching at Yeshiva University for many years. He's the national scholar of to the Jewish ideas and ideals, and he's written a number of books. And it's we're honored to have him, and we're going to for him to share Torah with us for the lead up to Shavuot. So I think today we're going to move to the Haftorot of Shavuot and Yecheskel, the first day. So, Vakasha, Rabbi Angel.
Okay, thank you so much. It's good to see you, Rabbi Kelman, quote unquote, in person in all of this. And it's great to see everybody back. Thank you so much for what thus far have been two amazing discussions and shiurim. Just one request from the get-go. As much as I love the classroom format, and there's something very magical about Zoom, my request is just please do not call out questions or comments, because I think that kind of interrupts the flow. And I will make sure to have a couple of pauses during the shiur where people can chime in and contribute to the discussions. But I think if we have calling out, it tends to throw the whole pattern off. So that's something we should just work on. Other than that, very much looking forward to hearing your feedback and what you have to say. You always can, at any time, you could post something to the chat as well. And that's another useful way to go about doing it. If you don't want to wait, or you have something on your mind right there, that's another good way to do it. Okay, so the last couple of weeks, we dealt with the Torah reading of the Revelation itself, which should go first. After all, it's the basis for everything. Today we move to the Haftarah of the first day of Shavuot, which is the celestial chariot, the Maaseh Merkava of Yecheskel. So I think I mentioned at the end of last week, don't worry, basically. The Talmud prohibits me from giving a public shiur on the esoteric meaning of the celestial chariot, which A, is a good idea, and B, it's even a better idea because I have no idea what that esoteric meaning is, and therefore I would not be able to share it in public right now anyhow. But even were I able to, which I am not, it would be prohibited to give a public shiur. I would have to do the master to disciple thing, which I'm not a master, and so you might all know it very well, but I don't, and so that's not what the shiur is about. What the shiur is about is that the surface level of the Haftarah, which is permitted to study, of course, that's something which we can discuss, and it opens up some fabulous discussions in rabbinic thought about the nature of prophecy, which starts off very abstract, and then it becomes very personal by the end of it, not because I'm a prophet, but because I think that what we can learn from the larger than life models of the prophets is something from which we all can benefit as religious Jews, each in our own way religious, in order to get closer to God through this Haftarah and ultimately through the world of prophetic revelation. Okay, so we'll start with source number one, which are just the first four verses. Again, Rabbi Kelman has kindly posted the link to the source sheets if you have not already received them in your email, or however you signed up for the registration. However you got it, you should have access to it. And so I'm just going to read again in the English, and then there are lots of things to talk about here. This is the very beginning of the book of Yecheskel, and it's also the beginning of the Haftarah because it's simply one and the same. In the 30th year, on the 5th day of the 4th month, when I was in the community of exiles by the Chabar Canal, in Hebrew it's just Nahar Kavar, the heavens opened and I saw visions of God. Okay, so let's just pause for a minute. Who is I? The answer presumably is, I hope, Yecheskel. Why would I think that? Silly me. How could I know if he just says, I saw visions? The answer is because we're reading the book of Ezekiel. So I'm sort of hoping, by virtue of the location of this verse, that I could ascertain the speaker. But it's remarkable that the book opens up with just this first-person account of this unbelievable vision without letting us know who are you? Please continue now. So fortunately, the narrative gets involved and interrupts here in verse 2. On the 5th day of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin. The word of the Lord came to the priest Ezekiel, son of Buzi, by the Kevar Canal in the land of the Chaldeans. And the hand of the Lord came upon him there. So verses 2 and 3 are not Ezekiel speaking. Rather, it's the book's editor. In tradition, we refer to this book's editor as the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the men of the great assembly, which includes the last of the prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. It includes people like Ezra and Nehemiah and some other great biblical figures. And then just this anonymous council of sages at the very end of the biblical period, going into the beginning of the rabbinic period. Okay, so they put in what we call a superscription, an introductory couple of verses, giving you the name of the prophet. In this case, it's Yechezkel ben Buzi. The setting and the date, we're in the year 592 BCE. That's the 5th year of Galut Yehoiachin, the exile of Yehoiachin, which took place in 597. So 5 years later, we're around 592, 593 BCE. And Yechezkel is located in Babylonia, because he was among those exiled by the wicked king Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylonia at that time. Then in comes verse 4. I looked, and lo, a stormy wind came sweeping out of the north, a huge cloud and flashing fire, surrounded by a radiance, and in the center of it, the center of the fire, a gleam as of amber. So verse 4, if you're keeping score, Ezekiel is talking again. Now, as verses 1 and 4 connect, right? And then verses 2 and 3, in the middle, they are the narrative interjection of the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the men of the Great Assembly, the editors of this book. And then Ezekiel goes on and relates his vision, meaning, were it not for the men of the Great Assembly, and we just had chapter 1, we would have zero clue who is speaking or when or where or anything, right? In other words, Ezekiel, when he wrote his passage, the rest of chapter 1, I saw this and I saw that and I saw this and I saw that, I would have no idea anything. So it's a very good thing that the men of the Great Assembly showed up and said, you know, we better identify this prophet or nobody will have any clue. I appreciate that a lot. But still, silly me, if I were writing this book and I were the editors, I always like questions or statements of this kind. I don't really think I could do a better job, but it sounds like I could do a better job. I would just put those introductory verses that are in verses 2 and 3, and here's a good idea. Why don't we make those verses 1 and 2, like in every other prophetic book, and then let Ezekiel talk from verses 3 and on. What a great idea. I wish I thought of it myself. It seems so painfully obvious that these verses seem out of order, right? Just have the introductory verses in the introduction, like every other biblical book, at least all the prophetic books. The prophetic book gets introduced in verse 1, sometimes verses 1, 2, and maybe even 3, but at least the introductory material comes first. Then we turn to the prophet. Let's hear his words. This is the only exception. And I don't think that this was a sloppy editing job where somebody just blocked and pasted in the wrong spot. It seems to be deliberate. So Rashi shows up on these verses and says that prophecy had to interrupt. The prophet Yechezkel is just speaking, is sharing his vision. So prophecy interrupted to explain who this is. That's a very poetic and wonderful way to describe what's going on here, which is the introductory verses, because of their position, sound like an interruption rather than just a good old-fashioned introduction. Really weird, but really, really interesting to me. So there's got to be a reason for this. Okay, so here's a suggestion. If you go through the entire book of Yechezkel, something very funny happens. Not in the ha-ha-ha, but just unusual. God doesn't call Yechezkel by his first name almost ever. He refers to him as something called Ben Adam, or in English, we usually translate that as son of man. In contrast, Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, who is a contemporary of Ezekiel living in the land of Israel at that time, God refers to him by the first name all the time. In fact, the narratives in the book of Jeremiah refer to Jeremiah by his name all the time. Fun fact, Ezekiel's name appears a whopping total of twice in this whole book. And it's a big book. One of them is right here. We just read it ourselves. That's 50% of everything. And there's one, it's easy to remember. It's chapter 24, verse 24. There's one other place where, because of the nature of the prophecy, God has to refer to Ezekiel, that people will talk about Yechezkel. In the book of Jeremiah, by contrast, that prophet's name appears a staggering 129 times in his book. So prophetic books can contain the names of the prophet. It's really okay. And so it sounds like here it's rather deliberate, so much so that even when it comes time to introduce the book with a commonplace standard formula of introduction, the editors felt to insert it rather than just to interrupt the prophet, rather than just to put it at the good old beginning where it normally would go. It sounds like the point of this is that Yechezkel's personality, and our name is very associated with our personality, is deliberately muted in his book because the personality that matters in the book of Yechezkel is not the prophet at all. It is God's personality. God's personality matters a ton in the book of Yechezkel, and as a result of that, his being, however you wish to describe that, is revealed in a way that it is revealed in no other prophetic book, which is why the sages actually were very nervous about including Yechezkel in the Tanakh, because God is so revealed, starting with these great visions in chapter 1 and onward, but even just with the nature of how God is expressing how he feels about being exiled from Jerusalem, how he feels about the destruction of the temple that's about to happen at this point in the story, as opposed to the people and how they feel about it. You read the book of Jeremiah, it is the most personal of prophets. You learn so much about him and how he feels about his prophetic mission, how he feels about his people, how he gets upset with God for sending him on this mission, given that it is a total disaster. All these things, you really, I don't feel more closely associated with any other prophet in Tanakh, except for maybe Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe, you actually do learn more about him because there's so much material in the Torah. But after that, Jeremiah is second place, but I don't know who's in third place. Those two prophets, you really get to feel their personalities, their torment, their struggles, their growth, their victories, everything. With Yechezkel, you hardly notice that he's there. Here's some visionary prophet whose name is almost absent from the book entirely. His personality plays zero role in all of this book, and it seems like the point of that is to highlight God's perception. Okay, that's point number one, just that he is incredibly anonymous and in a very meaningful way. So we already learned something about his book from these introductory 4 verses. Number 2, the book of Jonah, the prophet does something that even a first grader feels very weird about, which is he tries to run away from God. That's just too strange, right? We all know that. It's very strange. In some other course, I'll happily teach about Jonah. I have all kinds of fun things to talk about, because don't we all? It's a really interesting book. And the whale part is interesting, but far and away not the most interesting part. The prophet running away from God part, to me, is way more exciting and way more traumatic. How can a prophet do that? Okay, so I'm not going to talk about that too much today because we're not doing the book of Jonah, right? But I have to mention it, not just as a cool distraction, but because the sages in the ancient midrashim called the Mechilta and their parallels, they have to explain this. Somebody's got to explain, how could a prophet of God think that he's running away from God? That's ridiculous. So a leading answer to that is he's not running away from God, because God's presence is everywhere. But rather, according to one approach in the Mechilta, he was leaving the land of Israel because you cannot get prophecy outside of the land of Israel. That is a very ancient tradition that continues to be quoted by many, many, many later midrashim and then even later commentaries. Now, what's interesting about that answer, I hate to say it this way about a midrash, especially a venerated one like the Mechilta, is that this is absolutely wrong. I never say that about a midrash, but I have to say that today, just to make the dramatic point. Why is it absolutely wrong? Because, of course, prophets get prophecy outside of the land of Israel, including, among other people, Jonah himself in chapter 4 of his book, and it's just 4 chapters long. God speaks to him outside of the city of Nineveh. So the midrashim know that, okay? They're not just coming up with a careless error and they somehow miss that. The bigger exception is the entire book of Ezekiel, which is why I'm bringing all of this up in the first place. The entire book of Yechezkel is already in Babylonia when he gets this vision. And everything else. He is the prophetic leader in the country called Babylonia, today's Iraq. That's not the land of Israel at any point in our history. Okay, so the sages knew all of these things. In other words, they're saying something that is willfully wrong to answer a question in the book of Jonah, but I believe there's something much deeper going on that affects us over here. I will also add, before looking at a funny source that relates to the fact that it's an obvious mistake, is the fact that the entire Torah was revealed outside of the land of Israel. So when we think about, is there some rule that God must follow, that God must not reveal himself through prophecy outside of Israel, we know that that is not true, which is why I'm able to say it so bluntly. Great dramatic effect too, but I wouldn't do it if I thought it were wrong. It's plainly correct what I'm saying. And Chazal knew that too. Our sages knew that too. A funny version of continually repeating something that everybody knew was not correct is in source number 2. Rav Huna died. He was a great Babylonian sage. And so what an honor it would be for the greatest rabbis of that generation to give eulogies for Rav Huna. So source number 2 picks up this saga. And as you know, I don't care what synagogue you go to, there's always some wise guy in the back who has some comment to make, right? So sure enough, this source predates your wise guys in your localities, wherever you might be, and you have one in this story too. When Rav Huna died, Rav Abba opened his eulogy for him. So Rabbi Abba was one of the great sages. So he's giving a primary eulogy for Rav Huna, one of the great sages of that time. Our rabbi was worthy that the divine presence should rest upon him, except for the fact that Babylonia caused it not to rest. Alas, he lives outside of the land of Israel, and therefore he was unable to receive prophecy. It's a beautiful eulogy. I mean, what a great compliment. Prophecy being the pinnacle of one's relationship with God. So poor Rav Huna, he actually was that worthy, but alas, he lives in Babylonia, so he cannot lived at that point in the story in Babylonia, so he's unable to receive prophecy. Rav Nachman Bar Chisda raised an objection against this, and some say it was Rav Hanan Bar Chisda. So one of Rav Chisda's sons is sitting in the back room, and he starts grumbling about the eulogy during the eulogy. And he says, is it not stated the word of the Lord came to Yechezkel, the priest, son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans? Hey, the entire book of Ezekiel is outside of Israel. How could you say that about Rav Huna? So the truth is, in a Beit Midrash, in a house of learning, that's a really good question. At a eulogy, this is a good time to remain silent, let the rabbi say his thing. And afterwards, you might ask him, by the way, how could you try to impose that Torah idea? But don't do it during the eulogy. It's not appropriate, as his father is going to rebuke him, thereby implying that a prophet can prophesy outside of Eretz Yisrael. His father tapped him with his sandals. His father, kicks him under the table, to tell him to be quiet, stop heckling, right? You troublemaker. He said to him, have I not told you not to trouble everyone with questions in the middle of a eulogy? You troublemaker. There's a time and a place for questions like that. I think this is hilarious. I don't know about you. I love this story. But in the meantime, it drives home the point that Rabbi Abba gets up and gives a eulogy about a point that he knows to be wrong. Everybody knows, these sages knew the book of Ezekiel. They knew that Yechezkel lives outside of Israel, that he's in Babylonia. And there's a big book. And all of it is in Chutz La'aretz. All of it is outside of the land of Israel, and so on and so forth. Okay, that's enough of the story for today, but you certainly could read more. So usually when our sages make midrashim, they typically, it's actually a pretty good rule to stand by, don't contradict biblical verses. They expound upon, they might atomize a certain verse where they take one word and take it on a totally different turn from what the contextual meaning of the word might mean. They're trying to teach deeper religious lessons, all of those good things. They do not typically contradict like the entire Tanakh. So when they do, such as now, there's got to be a good reason for that. So there's 2 tracks within the book of Yechezkel that are worth paying attention to as long as we're in this part of the zone. One is, when Yechezkel gets this great celestial chariot. So for the mystics, that's where they get into their whole esoteric thing and the nature of God and the angelic hosts and all the secrets that I'm not allowed to teach you had I known what these secrets were, right? Okay. But on the surface level, when you read the book of Ezekiel, what's happening is very plain. God is being ridden on his chariot out from the temple, from Israel, to exile in Babylonia. That's what's happening. Chapter 1, it's happening in chapters 8 through 11 in more graphic terms. You can read the whole thing yourselves. It's unbelievably powerful to hear God being exiled with his people. Because the book is about him, it's not about us. The book of Jeremiah is much more about the people of Israel and their role during the destruction. The book of Ezekiel is about how God is handling the whole situation, Bashamayim, in the heavenly host. It's remarkable. So one piece of that, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai nails beautifully in Masechet Megillah over here in source number 3. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said, come and see how beloved Israel is before the Holy One, blessed be he. For every place to which they are exiled, the Shekhinah is with them. This is exactly what's happening in the book of Ezekiel. That God, as it were, is being exiled from his home in the temple in Jerusalem and going into the exile where the Jews are going. And when they are redeemed in the future, the Shekhinah will be redeemed with them. And so too, when Mashiach comes, the people of Israel will be redeemed and brought back to our land in Israel. God will be right there with us. It is an overwhelmingly beautiful paragraph, but it's actually exactly the pshat in the entire book of Yechezkel. It's exactly what the book of Yechezkel is driving home. And the second part of the book of Ezekiel, which we are definitely not going to get to today, because that's not the Haftarah of the first day of Shavuot, picks up on how God will return with the people. Exactly what Rav Shimon Bar Yochai is saying. It's all there in the book of Ezekiel. It's really amazing. So there's a negative piece of this, that we see God being exiled from his home, unlike the book of Jeremiah, where we talk about the Jews being exiled from their home. Right? It's just the human side of the same piece. And the other piece of it is, well, all of a sudden it becomes really amazing that Yechezkel is receiving prophecy outside of the land of Israel. Because the Jews at that time really did feel, once they were exiled and the temple was destroyed, I have to get my hands on this camera, I always forget that part. Once they were exiled and the temple was destroyed, then their relationship with God was over. That's really how they felt. And Yechezkel describes this in graphic detail and vivid detail throughout his book. And of course, he tells them that they are wrong. The God-Israel relationship is eternal. What better way to demonstrate that to the people of Israel at that time than to reveal this incredible prophecy to the prophet Yechezkel in the exile? So when the Midrash says, oh, God doesn't reveal himself in exile, it's not true at all. God certainly does reveal himself to prophets in exile. He just did in the few verses that we have seen so far. But the people did not think that it was possible. What the sages are reflecting is not an objective reality, but rather exactly what every single Jew of that time thought would be true. That God will never reveal himself to us again. And then when God does, there's no surer way to understand that God is with us forever, even in the exile. It's a very powerful way to begin the book of Yechezkel. So that's piece number one. I'm going to pause just to see what's going on over here. A very interesting suggestion to try to link the namelessness of the book to the prophecy outside of Israel. I hope I've explained. I don't think that those two things are related as much as just you have the namelessness, which is an important piece and also has great meaning for the book. And then you just have this issue of when God gives this prophecy to Yechezkel, that's the greatest consolation of them all. Just the fact that God is with us all together. Exactly as Rav Shimon Bar Yochai said. Okay, so now let's move on to the next piece. That's just Yechezkel in a pure vacuum. Now let's move on to the non-vacuum. There are other great prophetic works, and our sages and later commentators spent a lot of time showing how they are similar and how they are different. So Yechezkel, in his book, in the whole chapter 1, the whole Haftarah for the first day of Shavuot, is this very graphic and vivid vision of God and the celestial chariot, the Kruvim, the angelic host bearing God's presence, and eventually in chapters 8 through 11 of the book of Ezekiel, God actually being picked up from his home and transported into exile, into Babylonia, along with the people of Israel. It's remarkable. And it's a lot of verses. It's very, very, very long. It's chapter 1. It's mentioned again in chapter 3. It's mentioned again in chapter 8 a little bit, then chapter 10, all in the book of Ezekiel. It's just as vivid as ever in chapter 43, way down the line. It's mentioned a lot, okay? You can look all these things up. It's all there. It's all vivid. It's all long. When you read the book of Isaiah, Isaiah lived a couple centuries before Ezekiel. He also had a heavenly throne room sort of vision, but it's incredibly short. And we have it in source number 4. In the year that King Uzziah died, that's the year 736 BCE, just to give you, so it's 160-ish years before Ezekiel, I beheld my Lord seated on a high and lofty throne, and the skirts of his robe filled the temple. Seraphim stood in attendance on him, some class of angel. Each of them had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his legs, and with 2 he would fly. Okay, I don't have to get too involved in what these angels are supposed to look like. If you're an artist, you have to come up with something, and this is not the kind of art that I would promote just because of the physical representation of God and the heavenly host. Let's keep it in the prophetic visions. But if you're an artist and you feel the urge, figure out some way and talk to your local Orthodox rabbi about how to manage that sort of thing. For me, I'm just interested in one little detail for now, that God is on his throne, surrounded by these angels, and each angel, however they're supposed to look, have 6 wings apiece. Okay, check. Carry on. One would call to the other, holy, 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 the Lord of hosts, his presence fills all the earth. Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzavaot, Melo kol haaretz kevodo. The doorpost would shake at the sound of the one who called, and the house kept filling with smoke. That's the end of the vision. Then God speaks to the heavenly host there, and Isaiah gets involved, and then he goes back to his mission. So far, so good. So what I care about now is just that the sages recognize that Isaiah has a very short vision of the heavenly host, and Ezekiel presents a bunch of rather lengthy and articulate and detailed visions of the heavenly host. So what's interesting is source number 5. I would never have guessed this point, but that's why I'm not Rava. It's another reason why I'm not Rava. Rava was one of the great Amoraim in the 4th century CE. Rava said, all that Ezekiel saw, Isaiah saw. According to him, they're actually seeing the same thing. And they just have incredibly different ways of describing the same vision. What does Ezekiel resemble? A villager who saw the king. And what does Isaiah resemble? A townsman who saw the king. So it's just the country bumpkin hick and the city slicker. Okay, so this is a remarkable statement for so many reasons. The most important one being, they really did not sound like they were the same vision at all, but Rava comes along and says that they are. But I'm curious about what it means that one was a city slicker and one was a country bumpkin in regard to prophecy. Well, not only am I curious about that, but so are the greatest of our rabbinic thinkers. And they offer a series of different interpretations. I just wanted to share 4 opinions by 3 rabbis, because isn't that the way it's supposed to be anyhow? So there are 3 rabbis who will be mentioned here. I mean, one is really a school of rabbis, but one of their number proposed something. So we'll start with Rashi. Rashi thinks like this. Isaiah lived in Jerusalem. This is true. And he also spent time with human being kings, particularly Achaz and later on Chizkiyahu. He interacted with real kings, human kings. So Rashi thinks that the personal background of these 2 prophets reflects on how they reacted to their divine vision. Isaiah was used to talking to human kings, who at the time were the most awesome people you could possibly meet. So a sense of awe to a king, a human king, was something he was used to already. So when he had a vision of the King of Kings, namely God, of course it was electrifying and exalted and beautiful and elevating, but he was at least used to seeing a regular king. So the amount that he needed to jump to appreciate God was less than Ezekiel, who never encountered a human king. That's what it means by that he was a bumpkin. So the logic would be, the more shocked you are by something, the lengthier of an account you will give. So Isaiah was less shocked in the overall scheme of things. Okay, so 4 verses were good. Whereas Ezekiel, whoa, he's completely overwhelmed. I've never even seen a human king, and now I'm perceiving the King of Kings. All right, that requires a lot of talk. And so he goes at length. So what I care about is just the principle that Rashi is going for here, which is that the personal background of a prophet and the historical setting of this prophet actually might affect how a prophet relates his prophetic vision. Even if they did see identically the same thing. Doesn't matter if Rava's right or not. What matters is Rava thinks he's right, so I care about that. What matters also is that this is how Rashi understands Rava's comment, that the personal background of a prophet matters. Okay, so that's Rashi. Moving on to Rambam / Maimonides in his Guide of the Perplexed. Rambam proposes 2 different explanations to this Talmudic passage. The first one is, it might be that Isaiah's audience was at a higher level than Ezekiel's audience was. So if Isaiah says, I saw God surrounded by the angelic host, he could expect that his audience would be like, wow, cool. Okay, what happened next? They were ready for that one. Whereas Ezekiel's audience would be like, huh? What is that supposed to mean? Okay, I better explain in greater detail what I saw, because otherwise you have no clue what I am talking about. So according to Rambam's first approach, it has nothing to do with the prophet's background. It has to do with the audience, which also makes sense. Prophecy is not just some objective account of a prophetic vision, but the whole point is that The prophet encounters God and now is trying to convey that vision and the message to people. Okay, so the level of the people obviously is extremely important in terms of how you choose to present the vision. And that's how Rambam takes it on the first track. His second track is entirely different, where he says maybe the prophet Isaiah simply was a better prophet. There's no way to know this, but certainly possible. I don't know who's better, and I have no means of ranking anybody other than Moshe's number one, and after that, we don't rank them. Because how are we supposed to know? But we know Moshe Rabbeinu is number one because God said so. Okay, so that's easy. After that, I stay out of this. But Rambam is certainly allowed to say, maybe. That's what Rava has in mind, right? That maybe Rava is saying that Yeshayahu, Isaiah, was simply on a much higher prophetic level on the spectrum. And therefore, when he saw God in the heavenly host, he was less, relatively speaking, thunderstruck than Ezekiel, who was completely blown out of his mind. So far we've seen three approaches. Historical setting of prophet might affect prophetic presentation of message. Personal spiritual level of prophet might affect the presentation of a prophecy. And one has to do with the spiritual preparation or preparedness of an audience. What are they able to handle and how much explanation do they need? And you take it from there. The Baalei Tosafot, the great French rabbinic school that, offspring literally and spiritually of Rashi, but great French northern rabbis in the generation 2 and on after Rashi. The Baalei Tosafot on this Gemara propose a different answer still, and that is perhaps when Isaiah said, "I saw God sitting on his throne surrounded by angels," Yeshayahu's audience immediately believed him. Okay, you're a prophet then. They were prepared. That was the kind of thing that resonated with that generation. Whereas the audience of Yechezkel, if Yechezkel would have tried to get away with just a few verses, they would have said, nah, we don't think you really got this prophecy at all. But when he describes it in such vivid detail, okay, you can't make this stuff up. Read the chapter, my goodness. He obviously got a real prophecy. And so the detailed description is actually what helped convince his audience that he was a true prophet. So this has, again, to do with the rhetorical presentation of a prophecy toward the audience, but here it has to do with prophetic credibility rather than spiritual level of the audience. Who is right? I don't know. They could all be right. But these are great principles for prophecy, that prophecy represents the bridge between God and people. And so the personal level and background of the prophet and the personal level and background of the audience are all quite relevant in terms of how the prophet chooses to present a vision. Even if in theory they are identical visions at different times, they would still come out very different. Okay, I'm going to pause here because I see there's some chat activity. There's a good time to look. What does Rabbi Silber say? Hold on. God doesn't speak outside of Israel. Okay, somebody's quoting Rabbi Silber. I assume it's David Silber at Drisha, both because of the person asking the question and because it's a very important Rabbi Silber in general, who's quite the expert in Tanakh. But in the meantime, I don't agree with Rabbi Silber at all, just because, again, you have the book of Ezekiel, the book of Daniel, and the book of Jonah, among other later prophetic works that continue to present God as giving prophecy outside of the land of Israel. Okay. If God has gone to Bavel in exile with the Jews in the 5th year of Yehoiachin, does that mean God is not in the temple for the remaining years? The first temple is in existence and not in Judah with the people there. I assume it's there. I don't know how it really works, okay? I don't know where God's presence is supposed to be at any moment. I could tell you like this. If you read the book of Jeremiah, it's not about God's presence, it's about the temple. When the temple is burned to the ground, that's when the temple is not there anymore. When you read the book of Ezekiel, it has nothing to do with the physical building. It has to do with God's presence in that temple. And God's presence leaves the temple shortly before the destruction. I don't know. I don't need to mark it on my calendar exactly when. I could just tell you that God leaves the temple before the temple is destroyed, leaving basically what you and I would think of as an empty shell. There's still a building on Temple Mount at that moment in the real time of the book of Ezekiel, but it no longer has God there. So it's just a functional reality when the Babylonians burned the temple to the ground. So it comes out very different as a result of the way that it is done. Okay. So moving back over to here now, thank you for your comments. So getting back over to here. So far we've talked about the anonymous component of the book of Ezekiel. We've talked about prophecy outside of the land of Israel. We've now talked about how a prophet's background, both religious and political, and an audience's background, both religious and political, can seriously impact on how a prophet presents his prophecy to the nation. The next piece is how not only is that true, but our sages and later commentators understand very, very well that a prophet's background, personality, audience, etc., affect how the prophet perceives God in the first place. Not just how he conveys the vision to the audience, but how the prophecy itself is perceived. So Rashi already picks up in source number 1. It was a little point back when, but if you go back to source 1 and look at verse 4, I looked, and lo, a stormy wind came sweeping out of the north. So Rashi says the reason why God is perceived as emanating through a stormy wind is because it was very stormy times in Israel. We're right before the destruction of the temple. So the storm is not just, wow, God is awesome. That would have worked for me. I would have been fine just with the awe and power approach. But Rashi says, no, it has to do with the historical setting of the prophecy. Since God is this close to abandoning the temple and the temple is about to be destroyed, so that's why, according to Rashi, Ezekiel perceives God in a violent storm. Malbim takes it further and notices that Isaiah sees God in source 4 that we saw a moment ago. Isaiah sees God sitting on a throne. That's very stable. He's in his palace. He's on his throne. The temple is doing fine. Whereas Ezekiel sees God on a chariot that's on the move. And the logic is, again, since the Jews are about to go into exile, and God is about to go into exile, so everybody's on the move. He's not just sitting on a throne happily and calmly in his temple. He is on the move. So that's another dimension of how commentators understand that these prophets are not just, it's not just rhetoric, and it's not even just the spiritual level of the prophet or the audience. It's that this actually, what they see through their prophetic vision, that too is directly impacted by their experience and by their setting. The sages in Masechet Chagiga, we saw Rava's point in source number 5, who believes that Isaiah and Ezekiel are seeing the same vision. So the sages go on to ask, you could look this up on your own on that page. Well, wait a second. How could it possibly be that they see the same thing? Because the one detail we were able to pick out of Isaiah's vision is that these angels have 6 wings each. Okay, that's why I fussed about it before. That was the setup for this moment. Okay, 6 wings each. Well, in Ezekiel's vision, you could read the chapter yourself and you will agree that the angels have 4 wings each. So regardless of how any of these angels look, all I can tell you is they're definitely not the same thing. That's one thing I could walk away with. It's like, no, they didn't have the same vision because the angels don't even have the same number of wings. So the sages in the Talmud raised this question against Rava, but the answer is what fascinates me to no end, which is, since now there is an exile, the angels have lost 2 of their wings. So I'm not interested in the depiction or the factuality of how things are going in the heavenly host for this discussion. I am interested in what the sages are trying to say, which is that the historical setting directly impacts on the vision itself. If Isaiah could see an angel with 6 wings and Ezekiel could see an angel with 4 wings, something about the very vision itself is being colored by the event that was taking place during Ezekiel's time, namely, the destruction was impending and this was the end. So even the angelic host is crippled, as it were. They lose 2 of their 6 wings. So I think that is unbelievably powerful. There's one other piece before we leave this zone, and that is in the Jerusalem Talmud. I think we saw this source, or we talked about it a little bit last week, and we had this whole thing about lapis lazuli and sapphires and all that kind of good stuff. So now I'm going to mention it in this context because it comes up again just from the angle that we need it for this shiur. Source number 6. Rav Moshe said, regarding Babylonia, it is written, in appearance like a stone of sapphire. In the book of Ezekiel, in our prophecy, in chapter 1, not the passage that we looked at, but rather in verse 26, toward the end of that prophetic passage that we read on the first day of Shavuot, Ezekiel saw God's footstool, as it were, like a stone of sapphire. Or again, since scholars have pointed out there was no sapphire in that region at that time. Okay, so lapis lazuli, it was the color of sapphire. It was very blue. Okay, we all get it. So the sages here are focusing not on the blue part, but on the stone part. Okay. And regarding Egypt, it is written the likeness of a brick of sapphire. In the Revelation that we looked at last week, in chapter 24 of the book of Exodus, they saw a brick of sapphire. This teaches that as a stone is harder than a brick, so too the servitude in Babylonia was harder than the servitude in Egypt. So I think we touched on this source last time. Let's just touch on it a little bit more this time. This is an amazing statement. That here is Ezekiel, and for that matter, Moshe Rabbeinu and the people of Israel back when, perceiving a visionary God experience. This was a very high-ranking prophecy on both sides of the aisle. And in one place, Ezekiel sees God's footstool as a stone of sapphire. And in the other, the Israelites with Moshe Rabbeinu see God's footstool as a brick of sapphire. So the sages here are wondering, well, why is it a stone in one place and a brick in the other place? And their answer is fabulous. It's like, oh, the Israelites in Egypt made bricks. So when they're seeing something about God himself during the revelation at Sinai, the single most exalted religious moment in all of human history, they still see a piece of their slavery background in that vision. I don't know about you. I'm very into these sources. I think they're fantastically profound, talking about how you couldn't have anything better, that here's prophecy at the highest rank, but your personal experience, we're human. The human piece will always be there. And on the flip side, Ezekiel sees a stone, and so the sages take that to mean that the Babylonian servitude was harder, since a stone is perceived to be harder than a brick. And therefore, what the Jews were going to experience in Babylonian exile, at least at the beginning, was even worse than what they experienced in the land of Egypt back in the day. So the common denominator of all of these sources is it goes far beyond the idea of prophetic rhetoric and trying to how they present their prophetic vision. This has to do with how they perceive prophecy itself, that their humanness and their background and their setting impact on what they actually see, even with regard to God and the heavenly host. So I think that this is a great takeaway from the Haftarah of the first day of Shavuot. But now we have one last piece of our journey, and then we'll turn it over for the rest of the time to for questions. So Ezekiel describes his angelic host vision, where he sees the angels and he sees God on top of the angels, kind of riding as a chariot. And for that matter, Isaiah sees God sitting on his throne, surrounded by the seraphim. That's all nice and good, and obviously overwhelmingly powerful prophecies. But the question that the sages ask in a different place is, well, how exactly did these two prophets live to tell the tale? After all, Moshe Rabbeinu, right after the golden calf, asked God to show him his glory, whatever that means. Something very deep, something very overwhelming, and something way over my head. So I can't tell you what it means. But whatever it means, God replies basically, no, you will not be able to see whatever you would like because, source 7, but he said, you cannot see my face, for man may not see me and live. Okay, so I know one thing. Whatever a prophet wants to perceive about God, he cannot do that and live. So either don't see or don't live. And yet I believe with my entire being that Isaiah and Ezekiel were both prophets. When they say that they saw God surrounded by the angelic host, they are saying something that is true. And yet they woke up the next morning from their prophecy and wrote a chapter in Tanakh about it. How could that be? How did they wake up the next morning? So the Talmud is very occupied by this question. It seems very strange. If God tells the ultimate prophet, Moshe Rabbeinu, this is not possible, well, then it should not be possible for a lesser prophet either. And what the Talmud answers is truly fascinating. It's in source number 8 over here in Masachet Yevamot. I saw the Lord is to be understood in accordance with what was taught. All the prophets looked through a dim glass, but Moshe looked through a clear glass. They're answering this question that I just raised. You can see that in the context of the Talmud if you just read, the preceding discussion. I just put in the bottom line. The bottom line here is, all the other prophets looked through a dim glass or an opaque lens or something along those lines, and Moshe looked through a clear glass. So at the simple level, at the surface, what the Talmud is saying is very courageous of them. They're saying that the prophets Isaiah and Ezekiel were mistaken. They speak the truth. They receive prophecy, but they could not have seen God because Moshe saw through a clear lens and he understood you cannot see God. But there's a deeper dimension to this because, of course, when you look through an opaque or a dim lens, so two things happen. One, your view of whatever's going on the other side is obviously distorted, right? If you're looking through a clear glass, you can see clearly through, you can see whatever you're supposed to be looking at. But if you're looking through a dim or opaque lens, in part, you're seeing not the full reality. You're seeing something on the other side. You're able to look through, but you can't see it as clearly as somebody who has a clear lens. We all understand that. But of course, imagine just a pair of sunglasses. It's the easiest analogy in our day and age. If you hold up a pair of sunglasses and look through them, but don't know that you're holding up a pair of sunglasses, you will describe the world being much darker than it actually is, right? But you will also see your own reflection in the lenses. And if you don't realize that you're holding sunglasses, you'll think that that's part of the prophecy. You'll think it's part of the vision of what you are seeing. So imagine that you have no cognizance of what's going on. You don't know that you're holding sunglasses. You don't know that when you look into sunglasses, you might see the other side, but it will be darker than what you thought. But you also will see your own reflection. But let's imagine that you see all of these things and don't realize, oh, I'm holding a pair of sunglasses. Of course, that's why things look this way. But you think, and then you describe what you see. What you would describe is a much darker world than what it is. And you would describe yourself as being on the other side of the lens. Later rabbinic commentaries, without using the specific example of sunglasses, totally play up on this. They say that that's what Isaiah and Ezekiel are doing. They are getting true prophecy. They're seeing something of the divine through their lens, but they're not seeing a full picture, a clear picture, because they're not on the level of Moshe Rabbeinu. And in part, they are seeing their own personality, but don't realize it. They're not conscious of that. In other words, when they see God in the vision, it's not a clear vision, and in part, they're seeing something of themselves, but they don't know that. One of the commentaries in the 14th century who set this track of interpretation up is somebody named Rabbeinu Bachya ben Asher. And Rabbeinu Bachya is the one who really developed it. Rabbeinu Bachya plays off of source 9, which is in the Torah itself, where God has to explain that even though we call Moshe a prophet, and we call Miriam and Aaron prophets too, it's not just that Moshe is better than Aaron and Miriam, it's that he is of a totally different kind, even if we use the same word prophet for both. But they're not the same at all. It's not that Moshe is a better prophet, he's a different type of prophetic person. And we just use the word prophet for both of them. So God says in source 9, he said, "Hear these my words." This is God speaking in the Torah. "When a prophet of the Lord arises among you," meaning a regular prophet, not Moshe, "I make myself known to him in a vision." And the Hebrew for that is ba-mar-ah. Okay, ride with that ba-mar-ah. That probably will be relevant soon. "I speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moshe. He is trusted throughout my household. With him I speak mouth to mouth plainly," or in Hebrew, ba-mar-eh, which sounds like ba-mar-ah, different vocalization, but same consonants, "not in riddles, and he beholds the likeness of the Lord. How then did he not shrink from speaking against my servant Moses?" And then Miriam gets tzarat. You know the drill. It's a very overwhelmingly amazing story, very upsetting. But with that, God himself here stakes out turf on behalf of Moshe Rabbeinu, saying Moshe Rabbeinu is different from any other prophet. So you can't even understand him, even though you are prophets too. So Rabbeinu Bachya gets involved, and he's curious about the distinction between mar'ah, which is translated by the JPS here as in a vision, and mar'eh, which means plainly. So Rabbeinu Bachya takes it a different way. It is worth reflecting. This was my translation of this, and I promise you this was not a wordplay or a pun. It's just a good word for lehit bonein, but it's going to sound like I was trying to make a really cool wordplay. I wasn't, but it really is a cool wordplay, but this was not intended. Okay. Why regarding all prophets does it say mar'ah with a kamatz? Kamatz is just the vowel, which makes it sound like mar'ah. To signify imagination and confusion in prophecy. It appears that he wanted to liken the prophecy of other prophets to one who looks in a mirror. So Rabbeinu Bachya seems to be the first of our commentators to take mar'ah to mean that when you get prophecy and you're not Moshe Rabbeinu, in part, you're seeing a piece of yourself. You're seeing your own reflection. But Moshe Rabbeinu, whose prophecy was elevated above everyone else's, did not see through imagination, but rather a true vision, a mar'eh, close to the intellect. That is what our sages taught. All the prophets look through a dim glass. So Rabbeinu Bachya was the first to, so I talked about sunglasses, but really it was about mirror. Right? The idea is that other prophets, not Moshe Rabbeinu, they very much brought a piece of themselves to the table, but didn't even know that as they were engaging in this prophetic experience. I think that's amazing, and I wanted to share all of these ideas all before 11 o'clock. I just want to bring it down to earth for just a moment, and then I'll turn back over to the chat to see what's going on over there. Prophets, who themselves are the most exalted religious people who have ever lived, who have encountered God in a direct way that we can only dream about and be mesmerized by as we read their prophecies, including Ezekiel's Maaseh Merkavah. Well, if they're bringing their own personality and spiritual development and historical background and audience recognition and audience spiritual development into play, how much more does that apply to us, where we're not prophets at all? Where even as we engage in God, each one in our own way, each of us engaged with the Torah, each of us in our own way, each of us engaged in learning, each in our own way, whether we know it or not, we're constantly bringing our own religious development, background, personality, our peers and what they're thinking. These things are all figure into our learning, our prayer, our relationship with God, whether consciously or not. But I always love debates when people really are at it toe to toe in a Beit Midrash, and they're doing it, being nice about it, and they're all fighting for the truth, and each one is sure he has the truth, even after you've gone through all the sources and you've all seen the same exact sources. Obviously, if one knows way more than the other, it's unfair. But even when you have two real experts going for it, you realize that at some level, they're not going to convince one another after a point. Like, okay, you hurled all your arguments at the other one, you put out the weaknesses. At the end of the day, each one of us will still arrive at a different conclusion because each one of us is different. Our goal as learners is to become more educated, to try very hard to engage in the sources, to really know what the different opinions are, what the different texts are. But after that, we are always going to have a piece of the divine world of prophecy when we learn, and we're always going to have a piece of ourselves coming into the mix. So even though Ezekiel represents a much larger than life perspective on this, because here's a prophet of God engaged in the celestial chariot and encountering God with close proximity that we can only dream about as we read this Haftarah, it reminds us of our own religious state and our own religious encounter with God, with the goal of always getting closer to God and simultaneously always bringing ourselves to that personal engagement with God. With that, I turn over to chat. Let's see what else we have.
I have
Hold
a
on,
question.
let me just hang on. Let me just start with the chat. If I die in a dream, I still wake up the next morning. That is definitely true. Although usually you don't die in your own dream. You usually wake up that moment before. It's like, if you're falling off the cliff, as these things go, usually you wake up before you actually land. That's the way it's supposed to go. Moshe seemed to be awake. Okay, here is that source sheet thing. Okay, good. So I think we're actually up to date. Okay, so in the few minutes that remain, I'm now ready to turn it over to the group.
I have a comment to make, if I can. We
Please
talk
do.
about each of these prophets having a vision of God, but quickly, I read through the text, and what we read from Yeshayahu's description, they don't describe. They say they saw God, but they really saw the court around God, and a lot of description about the angels, about the seraphim, and how they moved or how many faces they had. It's not a description of it's not a visual description of God. It's a description of the setting.
You are completely correct, but still, the mere fact that Yeshayahu says, I beheld my Lord seated on a high and lofty throne. No more description. You're right. But that's enough to trigger the discussion. Because what does that mean that he saw God? It doesn't matter what did God look like in the vision. You're absolutely right about that. But the mere fact that he said that line triggers the Talmudic imagination into asking, what's going on here? How could he have said that he saw God, and yet we know he's a true prophet, and yet we know that prophets can't perceive God? Right? So that's where this discussion comes from. But you're completely correct. And the same thing with Ezekiel's vision. There's no description of what God, quote unquote, looks like in the vision. It's all about the heavenly host and the wheels and the whatever chashmal is, and basically, you know, the chariot, the celestial chariot. You are right. The physical description in the prophecy is not about God himself.
I think they felt God's presence because of that experience, but whether it doesn't seem to conflict to me with that you can't see God and live. I don't know that from what they say, I don't see that they saw God itself, you know. That's
Right.
all.
I totally hear. All I can tell you is you're right. There's certainly no description. All the same, the discussion in the Talmud derives from the fact that, okay, the mere fact that he said that line is enough to wonder what's going on here. But you're right. Excellent observation. Okay.
Okay, any other questions? No, okay.
Yes, I was wondering about the Mareh and Mara, whether the reason we dip Maror in Charoset is to change the Mareh it provides as an ascriaria.
That is extremely clever and one of the best midrashim I've heard in a long time.
What do you mean? You have to make it yourself.
That's really something. I will tell you this: if you want a real answer, maror and mar'eh are not from the same root, right? Mar'eh is from the word ro'eh, resh aleph hey, and maror is mem resh resh, or bitterness. But as long as you're bringing up maror, and we're already at the end of the shiur, we've gone from the exalted prophecy and visions of the angelic host down to bitter herbs at a seder. Why not?
I don't think grammar should affect midrashic interpretation.
That's what I said. That's why I said Ein Shalim al Hadrash. I agree with you that I'm not challenging your interpretation. I'm praising it. I think that it's one of the most creative things I've heard in a long time. But I will say, but again, as long as everybody on the screen recognizes that it's your own midrash rather than something that actually might be connected in the pshat of the Torah itself, I'm not challenging it. Even Ezra's axiom to live by is Ein Shalim al Hadrash. What that means is once you recognize that something is a midrash, you shouldn't be asking roots of a word. I just want to clarify to make sure that everybody understands that you're making a midrash. That's all I was trying to do.
Ibn Ezra say that? Where does Ibn Ezra say that?
Time and again, if you get any search, Bar Ilan University search program, there's a regular line of his. Just because it's important to recognize that he knows when a thing is far away from the text, rather than just saying "fed" doesn't match the text, he just says, "Look, don't use the tools of the pshat learning to challenge a midrash. Learn from the midrash what you should learn, but don't think that this is what the text is saying." That's all.
Thank you very much.
Oh, anytime. But since you're bringing up maror in the realm of midrash, I'll just say that the reason why we eat maror on Pesach, even though we're talking about Shavuot and we're way beyond Pesach at this point, well, not so beyond, but beyond enough. My mind is far away from Pesach and very into Shavuot right now. I don't know about you. The fact that our Haggadah talks about the bitterness of our experience, that itself likely is a midrash on why we eat maror on Pesach. Closer to the pshat reading of the story is the Orach Hayyim, the great Rav Chaim ben Attar, in 18th century Morocco, who's in the standard Mikra Gedolot. He understands that the reason why we eat maror with the Korban Pesach is because it is incredibly yummy. Don't you like a spicy something with your shawarma? I do. You probably do too. It actually enhances the mitzvah because it makes it taste better. It's basically like mustard. It's a condiment, and that's closer to the mark in terms of the pshat reason of why we have maror on Pesach. But then Rabban Gamliel darshans it into the very familiar that it reflects the bitterness of our experience, and that certainly has become the meaning. And that's certainly how our Haggadah, which quotes that midrash, wants to take it. So even in the maror department, there's a midrash that has become our way of experiencing the observance, but we sometimes lose what probably is closer to the original setting of why we do that. On that incredibly happy note, so thank you for bringing that up. That was a fabulous midrash, Gershon. I appreciate this type of creativity more than you realize, but hopefully at least I'm conveying some of that appreciation right now. On that incredibly happy note, I want to express my pshat appreciation of Rabbi Kelman and Torah in Motion. Thank you again for having me. Thank you all for coming and participating so beautifully. Next week, we will do the always famous and popular Habakkuk, who is reflected on the second day of Shavuot Haftarah reading, and I look forward to doing that with you next week. So have a great rest of week.
Thank
I'll
you.
talk to you soon. Thank you as always.
Thank you very much. And of course, next week is a holiday in the United States, this week in Canada. So it's an opportunity to invite your friends who aren't working to come and join us. Monday, 10 o'clock, for lots of people, it's not a great time. So myself included. Please, we will have a classes. We always, almost always have classes on holidays. So please invite. And want to thank you, Rabbi Angel. And I love that point, what you said on the maror. It's sort of, I don't think anybody ever thinks of that the maror is the condiment to improve. It says how we've totally switched it. So that was actually a beautiful insight right at the end. And this evening, of course, Mark Shapiro was back. We did not have his class last week because of Yom Ha'atzmaut Mamash, so people could go out and celebrate. But 8:30 tonight, continuing his discussion on the Musar dispute, and tomorrow Rabbi Shulman's class on Megillat Ruth at 1 o'clock, and Rabbi Slipkin on Wednesday morning at 10 a.m. and Natty Helfgott 8:30 p.m. at night, and Thursday our Parsha Shir, Friday my class on the Siddur, and that will get us through the week. So I want to thank everybody. Look forward to seeing you. Those who are in Canada, enjoy the rest of Victoria Day. I don't know who's here, and those who are in the United States, get back to work and have a great day and a great week. And we look forward to seeing with you. Okay, be well, everybody. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Happy Victoria Day.
Oh, thank you very much. Okay. What can I do? We're British subjects here, So almost, Okay.
Unexamined by my